His real name was Herbert Graf. Vienna, 1906. He was 5 years old when a fear began to take hold of him that would eventually make him refuse to leave the family apartment. He was afraid of horses. Specifically, he was afraid that a horse would bite him, or fall down, or that he would see a horse fall and be overwhelmed by something he could not name. In early 20th century Vienna, horses were everywhere, in the streets, pulling carts, impossible to avoid. And so Herbert stopped going out. His world shrank to the size of 4 walls. What made this case unusual from the beginning was how precisely Hans could describe his fear. He was not simply anxious in a vague, undirected way. He had specific images. A horse with a black muzzle. A heavily loaded cart. A horse falling in the street and thrashing. He described a fantasy in which a plumber came and replaced his body, gave him a new, bigger one. He talked freely with his father, who recorded everything and sent the notes to Freud. And Freud, who never met Hans directly, read those notes and built an interpretation that would become one of the most debated cases in the history of psychology. Freud's interpretation was characteristically bold. He believed the horse was not the real object of Hans's fear. It was a symbol. The horse, Freud argued, represented Hans's father, a large, powerful figure whose authority Hans both loved and feared. Hans was working through what Freud called the Oedipus complex, the child's unconscious rivalry with the same-sex parent for the attention and love of the other. The fear of being bitten was, in Freud's reading, a displaced fear of castration. The falling horse was a wish, the wish that the father would fall, would be gone. And Hans could not consciously hold any of this. So the mind placed it onto a horse. Freud's specific interpretation of little Hans has been challenged ever since. Critics argue that the Oedipus complex was a projection, that Freud imposed a pre-existing theory onto a child's words rather than listening to what those words actually said. Behaviorists argued that Hans's phobia was simply a conditioned fear response. He had witnessed something frightening involving a horse and learned to associate horses with danger. Both criticisms have merit. But something else in the case has held up across a century of debate. The idea that a child's fear is almost never only about the thing the child says they are afraid of. That anxiety in childhood finds a container. And that container is rarely the real source. This is what makes little Hans relevant far beyond the Freudian debate. Because adults do exactly the same thing. The person who is terrified of flying, but whose anxiety, on closer examination, is really about losing control. The person who cannot stop worrying about their health, but whose fear, when traced, is really about death and what comes after it. The person afraid of confrontation, but whose real fear is of being abandoned if they are honest. We all carry containers. We all have official fears, the thing we say we are afraid of. And we all have the real fear underneath. The one we do not yet have a name for. Herbert Graf recovered. The phobia lifted, gradually, over the course of his conversations with his father. He grew up to become a distinguished opera director, a man who spent his life interpreting the emotional truth in stories on a stage. And the world that had once been too large and too frightening to enter, he eventually walked into it and made something of his own there. Little Hans matters not because Freud was entirely right, but because a frightened child trying to make sense of a large and confusing world is not a historical curiosity. It is every child. And in many ways, it is every adult too.